When you create an animation, at some point you'll be required to make a decision between shock and anticipation. Shock will have an effect of an abrupt change and it will catch the viewer off guard, whereas anticipation will prepare the viewer for what's coming next. Even if this is done on a subconscious level, the viewer will expect something to happen after the initial animation. Let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to go and create a cube again. And just like before, I'll set the Y of this to 100 and then freeze the transformations. And I'll animate the cube, just like we did before, to jump up. Let me go and keyframe this here. Then I'll go to, let's say, half a second. And then move the cube up. Let's say to 400. And then keyframe again. And then go forward by 12 more frames. And then put this back down to 0. And keyframe again. I'll open up the F-Curve Manager by right-clicking and then bringing this up. Let me push this to one side. The property here doesn't show up. If this ever happens, just make sure that you go to View and then come down to Automatic Mode so that the things that are keyframed will be visible in this view. Otherwise, you'll have to manually drag the values in here. I'm going to press H and I'll do the same again. I'll first select the keyframe and give it an abrupt jump like that. I'll increase the hang time, holding down the Command key, and I'll make it fall quite abruptly as well, like that. If I play, this is the animation we have now. Now this happens a little too quickly. Let me actually increase the height of this, so let me zoom out from this. And I'll get the cube to bounce up more, so I'm going to click and drag this up, holding down the Shift key so it remains on the same line here. Let's say it goes to about 800. Come down here, and if I now play it, this is what I have. I'm going to increase the hang time a little more by clicking and dragging this out with the Command key, and then I'll make these go slightly higher up, so the start and the end are both a little more abrupt, like that. And I'll play this again for you. Now, what I mean by a shock factor is that it just starts abruptly. Let me press H to center this again. You see, at the beginning, it's set to 0, so nothing happens, and right away, it just jumps up. But if you want the viewer to have some clue to what's going to happen next, you normally create an opposite action before the first one starts. In this case, an opposite action might mean that the cube goes down first before it jumps up. This can be done in a couple of different ways. For example, if I select the first keyframe, I can actually dip this down like that. So before the cube goes up, it actually dips down first for a few frames. So here's what that's going to look like. Now that's a little too quick, so it's hard to see. So let me slow this down by clicking and dragging this towards right. So I'm giving this more time to go down, then up. Here we go. It's still a little too abrupt, so let me slow down the entire animation. So I'm going to zoom out from this. And one quick way of changing the speed of an animation, if it has more than 2 keyframes, is by using the Region tool. This tool can be found under Edit, Region tool, or R is the shortcut. I can now highlight a region or a range, like that. And then it will give me a bounding box like it does in a program like Photoshop. I can now click and extend it sideways like this. And that keeps the relative distance between the keyframes the same, but it extends or slows down the animation. I'll press R to come out of this, and I'll play this again. You see how the cube dips down first before it jumps up? That's what we mean by anticipation. Now, anticipation can be created in many different ways. You can get the object to go in the opposite direction, like we just did here. Or if you want, in this case, you could actually squash the object as well. So let's say, for example, there was a floor there and it couldn't go below the floor. Well, in that case, you could just squash the object, then it shoots up. So let's have a look at how that's done. Let me first go and get rid of this curve here. So I'm going to click and drag this back up. So there is no anticipation or undershoot. I'm going to come down here and play again, just to confirm that. So yes, it starts quite abruptly. What I'm going to do is to select all of these keyframes, push them towards right with the Shift key held down so it remains on the same line by, let's say, maybe 6 frames or so. So that gives me enough time to create the anticipation. So I'm going to go to the beginning. I'll get the cube to squash now. So for now, I'll just go and close this, get my squash and stretch, add this to the cube, go to Object, Fit to Parent, and just like before, I'll set the top to 200, that's the height of the cube, bottom to 0, and I'll actually move the squash and stretch down with the Shift key held down so it moves down by 100 exactly, so that when I increase or decrease the factor, you see it just happens from the base. I'll undo that. I'll add more segments to the cube. I'll select the cube, go to segments, let's say we go 25 by 25 by 25, and maybe turn the fillet on as well so the edges are nicer, and then increase this to, let's say, 5. What I have now is 6 frames for us to create the anticipation. So I'll go to squash and stretch. I'm going to start at 0. At the beginning, I don't want any squashing or stretching to happen, so I'll just go and keyframe the factor. I'll then go forward to, let's say, frame 4. I'll then squash this a little bit, like that. I'll keyframe it. Then I'll go to frame 6. This is when the cube starts jumping. I'll then set this back to 100%. If I play it now, this is the anticipation now. Of course, we can open up the graph editor for this as well. So if I go and right click, Animation, F-curve, and now we can tweak the function as well. So how does it squash? So you can see here, it starts squashing like that. And then as you can see with this graph, it slows down before it reaches this last keyframe. Now I don't want it to keep slowing down. If it does, it will then look as if it's just going to stop. No, I want that to continue. So I'm going to click and then drag this down so it's a bit more of an abrupt shift into that keyframe. So it doesn't ease in or slow into that keyframe anymore. So if I go back and play again, that gives it more energy, that gives it more character. And this prepares the viewer to what's going to happen next. Let me stop this. If I want this to squash more, I can go here and then just simply lower this keyframe down. Click and drag it down. And you see the lower this goes, the more squashed this will be. But apart from that, the rest of the animation will be the same. If I go back and play again, this is what we have. Now this particular animation feels like it needs more squash and stretch, especially when the cube jumps up. So we'd like to see that stretching, and then when it comes down again, it should squash again, just like we did in the squash and stretch lesson. And I'll leave that for you to create. And it's important to remember that it's not just squash and stretch that you use to create anticipation. You could use any opposite action to create anticipation. Let me show you one more example. I'll come out of all of this. I'll create a new scene by pressing Command N. I'll then go and create a cube. I'll go to the front view. I'll lift the cube up. I'll go to coordinates. Looks like I went a bit too far, so I'm going to go and set this to 100. Freeze the transformations. And what I want to do now is to rotate the cube from this corner. So it will rotate this way. So imagine there's a little pin here, and then the cube will rotate from here towards there. Well, let's do that. I'm going to go and create a null. Put the null to one corner, like that. I'll go and call this left pivot. And I'll put the cube inside the left pivot. So when I rotate this, if I get my rotation tool, when I rotate this, that's where the cube is going to rotate from. And let's say this is the animation I want to create. I want this to go from here, bang, here. So how do you create anticipation for this? Well, if you remember what we talked about earlier, you'd rotate this in the opposite direction. But it wouldn't work now, would it? If I click and drag this way, now it rotates down. Now the opposite rotation action for this would be a rotation from this corner. So for that, we'll create another null. I'll go create one more null, put this one to this corner, I'll then go and rename this to be right pivot. And I'll put this left pivot one inside the right pivot. So if I now go to left pivot and rotate this, that's what I'm getting. And if I rotate the right pivot, this is what I'm getting. So let's now go and animate this. First, I'm going to set my frame rate to be 24 by pressing Command D. And then here, FPS goes to 24. Let me also press N and A so I can see the actual shading. And eventually the animation I want to create is this going from here to here. So the anticipation would be to first rotate it in the opposite direction. So I'll go to the right pivot. At the beginning of the timeline, I'll keyframe the banking. This is the animation I want to create. This is the banking that I'm going to animate. So I'm going to go and keyframe this at the beginning. I'll then go forward, let's say by 8 frames. I'll rotate this that way, let's say by maybe 25 degrees. And then keyframe again. And then go forward by 8 more frames. And then set this back to 0 and keyframe it. So that this is the animation we have now. So it goes from 0 to 25 degrees and then back to 0 again. And then at this point, I can get the left pivot to start rotating. So I'm going to go to the left pivot. I'm on the 16th frame, which is the time when the last keyframe of the right pivot was created. So I'll go back to the left pivot, keyframe the banking, and then go forward to, let's say, frame 32. And then I'll just click and then drag this down so it goes minus 90. And I'll keyframe again. So far, this is the animation we created. Now, although it doesn't look perfect, it's getting there. I'm going to need to go and open up the F-Curve Manager now. So I'll just go to Window, F-Curve. And let's first start with the right pivot. If I select the right pivot, press H so I can see everything. Initially, let me first again put this towards left. Initially, what I want to do is for it to take some time to go from here and rotate backwards. So I'm going to slow this down. Like that. If I play, you see that's going to be a little slower now. It's almost like it's breathing. It goes, then it starts rotating. So I'm going to select this and give it a bit more hang time. So let's see what that looks like now. Of course, when I do this, I want this to be a bit more of a slam. So right now it slows down as it reaches this keyframe here. So you can see the cube kind of slows down as it reaches this one. I don't actually want that. I want the cube to gain more momentum. That's the whole purpose of creating this anticipation, so that the cube can go back and then shoot forwards. So this keyframe here actually represents 2 keyframes. If I select the left pivot, that's the first keyframe of the rotation B of the left pivot. And it's also the last keyframe of rotation B of the right pivot. But if I have them both selected, like that, I can now click and drag this up, and you see the other side gets affected as well, so that the action feels a bit more continuous. So I'll get this one to be a little more abrupt here. So it doesn't kind of slow in, but it slams down. So if I now go back and play, let's see what this looks like. Now I think that this could be a little quicker. So I'm going to hold down Shift to break these 2 apart. So I can just expand this. So this section starts a little more abruptly. Let's see. And I can still see that there's a bit of a pause here. So between this and this, there's a bit of a pause. I actually went the wrong way. I need this to come down this way so that this line kind of continues smoothly. So if I go back and play, now that feels a lot more natural and seamless. So the transition going from this rotation to the other rotation is a lot more seamless now. Because this line here continues seamlessly. So if I go back and play this one more time. But the other problem here is that it's kind of slowing down a lot. So I'm going to take this last keyframe, squash this in with the Shift key held down so it remains on the same line. And then I'll just go and push this up as well a little bit. Let's see what this looks like. So it's more of a slam at the end. So I'll play that again from the beginning. So it's as if it's got some weight attached to it. Let me now come out of all of this, go to the perspective view, and then play this from here now. So I'm going to go to the beginning. So although we didn't use squash and stretch for this, we still managed to create anticipation. As you can see, there are tens of different ways of creating anticipation. It'll all depend on what you're animating and how.